Think your life is tough? In the Viking Age, winter could freeze you solid. The gods demanded blood, and your neighbor might fight you for your goats. You'd wake up in darkness, eat moldy bread, dodge disease, and pray Thor wasn't angry today. And that's just a starting. Imagine waking up with frost on your eyebrows, and you're still indoors. Viking winters regularly hit minus 30 degrees Celsius, and their wooden homes weren't built for comfort. They were built to survive, but barely. These longhouses didn't have chimneys, just a central fire burning in a pit. The smoke? It filled the whole room before slowly drifting out through cracks in the thatched roof. That meant families lived in a mix of smoke and freezing cold. Walls were made from sticks, mud, and turf, and while they trapped some heat, they also kept in moisture and rot. You couldn't just sleep near the fire, there wasn't enough space, so families would often pile together with their livestock to stay warm. Pigs, cows, goats, sometimes even chickens, all sleeping side by side. The most vulnerable didn't last long. Babies, the sick, and the elderly often died from the cold, especially during what Norse mythology called Fimbulwinter, a terrifying time said to last 3 whole years without summer. And even outside the myths, archaeological digs show mass winter graves, with victims frozen or starved during harsh seasons. Surviving the cold was only part of the problem. All that smoke inside caused chronic lung damage. Many Vikings spent their lives coughing, wheezing, or worse. And without proper ventilation, sickness spread fast. One fever in a crowded longhouse could wipe out an entire family by spring. But spring didn't mean safety either, because when the snow melted, everything buried in it, waste, spoiled food, rotting animals, came back to life. And that's when things got really dangerous. Imagine taking a bite of warm, freshly baked bread, only to feel your molars split in half. That was breakfast in the Viking Age. Their bread was dense, coarse, and often filled with grit, not by accident, but because of how it was made. Grain was ground between stones, and tiny fragments of quartz or sand would break off into the flour. You didn't see it, but your teeth felt it. Over time, chewing literally filed teeth down to the nerve. In Viking skeletons, tooth wear was extreme, smooth like glass, nerves exposed, constant pain. But that's only the beginning. If the bread didn't hurt you, the meat might have. Undercooked pork and poorly stored fish were common meals, but also a guaranteed way to ingest tapeworms. And without ovens or thermometers, people barely knew what fully cooked even meant. Sanitation? Forget it. Food was stored beside animals. Butchers worked with bare hands, often caked in filth. Moldy cheese? Still edible. Rotten eggs? Better boiled and salted. The line between safe and deadly was thin and invisible. Even grain, their staple, was unreliable. One bad season and it grew ergot, a fungus that caused hallucinations and death. People didn't understand what was happening. They thought it was witchcraft or punishment from the gods. So every bite wasn't just a meal, it was a gamble, a test of survival with no guarantee of tomorrow. And yet, this was considered normal. You ate what was there, or you didn't eat at all. But the most dangerous meal Vikings faced wasn't even food. And that's what we'll get into next. Imagine screaming into a leather strap while someone saws through your leg. And that's the best case scenario. In the Viking Age, surgery wasn't healing. It was survival by fire. There were no anesthetics, no sedatives, just pain, pressure, and the hope that you'd black out before the worst part. For serious infections like gangrene, limbs were amputated using knives heated in fire, not just to cut, but to cauterize instantly. Flesh sizzled, nerves lit up, and if you didn't go into shock, you were considered lucky. But that was nothing compared to trepanation, the act of cutting open the skull to release pressure from head injuries or madness. Archaeologists have found Viking skulls with clean circular holes bored straight through bone and signs of healing. Meaning the patient lived, meaning they were fully awake. Now picture childbirth. No sterile clinics, no pain relief, just midwives, herbs, and whispered prayers. Most babies were born on the floor of a smoky longhouse surrounded by livestock. If the umbilical cord tangled or the baby came britch, there were no tools, only fingers and force. And it wasn't just the baby at risk. 1 in 3 women didn't survive childbirth. In Viking culture, dying in battle brought honor, but dying in bed during birth was just as common, and it was considered normal, expected, inevitable. So the next time you feel a headache coming on, imagine being handed a sharpened rock. But even death wasn't the worst fate back then. Because the Vikings believed something far darker waited after. And that's what's coming next. In Viking medicine, disease wasn't biology, it was revenge. A sudden fever? That wasn't an infection. It was the result of being shot by elf shot, invisible arrows fired by angry spirits. They believed elves, dwarves, and trolls could enter your body and wreak havoc from within. Therefore, instead of seeking a cure, Viking healers, called cedars or vulvas, performed rituals to chase spirits out. But the diagnosis wasn't just folklore. It could get personal. If you got sick after arguing with a neighbor, they might have cursed you. And if you didn't recover, others might accuse them of witchcraft. This fear created a dangerous cycle of blame, isolation, and vengeance. Lightning strikes? That wasn't weather. That was Thor, god of thunder, expressing his rage. A crop failure? You angered a land spirit. To make peace, families left offerings of food and blood outside their doors or buried them beneath farms, hoping the spirits would back off. There were herbs, yes. Yarrow, angelica, and meadowsweet were common remedies, but even these were often used alongside chants, bloodletting, or burning hair to drive the sickness out. And if you survived, it was credited to the gods. If you didn't, it meant the spirits had claimed you. Or worse, your soul had wandered to hell, the Norse underworld reserved for those who died without honor. But here's the twist. The only way out of hell was blood. And that led to some of the Viking Age's most brutal sacrifices, which you'll see in the next chapter. In the Viking Age, revenge wasn't just expected, it was sacred. Families were locked in blood feuds that lasted generations. One insult, one stolen goat, it could trigger a chain of killings that never ended. Therefore, to settle scores, clans didn't wait for battlefields. They attacked in the dead of night. Longhouses were often set ablaze while people slept inside. And the worst part? The attackers were often your own kin, rival branches of your extended family, fighting over land, honor, or marriage disputes. But fire wasn't the only terror. Some raids turned into kidnappings or forced slavery. If you were young and strong, you were dragged onto the ship and sold. If you weren't, you were left to burn. And then there's the blood eagle. Historians still debate it, but some sagas describe it like this. The victim is tied face down, their ribs cut from the spine, and lungs pulled out like wings. It was said to be a punishment for traitors and a message to anyone thinking of betrayal. But that wasn't the only punishment feared. Some were buried alive with stones placed over their chests. Others were tied to trees, left for wolves, not for crime, but to avenge a dishonor. And yet, what made Viking vengeance so terrifying? It never truly ended. Even after death, your ghost could be hunted down. And if you think that's wild, wait until you see how they treated the dead to stop them from coming back. That's what we'll uncover next, and it only gets darker. Before a Viking child ever picked up a toy, they were fighting to stay alive. Roughly 30% of children died before age 5, from infections, starvation, exposure, or all three. There were no doctors, no vaccines, and no safety nets. If a baby got sick in winter, families often had only one choice: wrap them tighter and hope. But even if you survived that brutal beginning, your childhood ended fast. By age 7, most Viking children were expected to work, tending fires, feeding animals, and hauling water. If you were a girl, you were trained for childbirth and household duties. If you were a boy, you learned how to fish, farm, and eventually swing an axe. And by age 12, you were considered marriage material. Not emotionally, not spiritually, but physically. Strong enough to survive the duties of a spouse. There was no such thing as adolescence in Viking society. No grace period, no pause. Even play was dangerous. Bones and wooden swords were toys, but also tools to train for a life of war. And frostbite, it wasn't rare, it was expected. One winter without boots could mean missing toes for life. There was no school, no formal reading lessons, but every child could memorize sagas, sharpen a knife, and skin a fish, or they wouldn't last long. And if you think childhood was hard, wait till you hear what they did to the dead. Because some Viking corpses weren't buried to rest. They were buried to be stopped. They didn't wear armor. They wore animal skins. They didn't walk into battle. They charged, screaming, eyes glazed, mouths foaming, often naked or nearly so. These were the Berserkers, Viking shock troops feared by both enemies and allies. According to sagas, they were unstoppable. They felt no pain, didn't seem to bleed, and kept fighting even with spears in their sides. Some historians believe they were epileptic. Others point to hallucinogenic mushrooms like Amanita muscaria as the source of their madness. And some might have just been deeply disturbed men with nothing left to lose. Their rituals were dark. They howled like wolves, bit their shields, and whipped themselves into a frenzy, a state the Norse called Berserkergang, or the rage of the bear. One account claimed they were so wild they had to be chained up before battle. Or they'd kill their own men. Berserkers were so dangerous that even Viking kings eventually tried to ban them from armies. But the legend never died. To this day, going berserk is still part of modern language, a brutal echo from a time when rage could be a weapon. And if that's what the warriors were like, what kind of horror were they running from? Surviving the Viking Age wasn't living, it was enduring. If you made it this far, hit like, subscribe, and watch the next brutal chapter unfolding right on your screen now.